All right, so we're going to continue on here with the educational series on long-term care planning and insurance, and we're going to jump right in here to section number 2. What is long-term care? Now that you have a good foundational understanding of longevity and the changing demographics, we're going to jump right into defining long-term care and really helping make the complex very easy. So this is really the 101 portion of the education. So what is long-term care? Well, quite simply, by definition, long-term care is assistance, which is help, that's provided to someone who has a condition or an illness or a cognitive impairment that limits their ability to perform normal day-to-day activities of daily living. Now, activities of daily living is a phrase that you'll hear about in all the literature about long-term care, so it really makes sense to help explain what those 6 things are. The ADLs, as they refer to them, are bathing, eating, dressing, toileting, transferring, and continence. And if you can't perform any 2 out of those 6 things, then you now need what's referred to as long-term custodial care. Or in a separate category by itself is if you have a cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, things of that nature. These are conditions that really require substantial supervision, really from a safety perspective, either for other people or for yourself. Now, here's 4 people that have kind of reached the limelight, so to speak, in the media in the last 10 to 20 years. We have Katharine Hepburn and Ronald Reagan, Michael J. Fox, Pope John Paul II. But I'm pretty sure that we could probably swap out those pictures and unfortunately put people that we know and care about and love in there instead. So long-term care is really helping somebody with physical activities of daily living or supervising somebody who has a cognitive impairment. Now, what's important to note is that your doctor has to certify that your condition, either physical or cognitive, will last for at least 90 days in order for it to be considered quote-unquote long-term care. Anything short of that would really be considered short-term care, acute, skilled care as they refer to it. So now, when you look at a long-term care patient, or if you take all 15 million people who need long-term care right now, what you would recognize is that there's actually 3 different levels of care that they could receive, or that presently they are receiving. Now, it's pretty disproportionate. Skilled care is like open heart surgery or a bone marrow transplant, a hip replacement, something like that. So is it part of long-term care? It is. Is it a big part of long-term care? Not really. It's only about half of 1% of the needs that people have day in and day out. Intermediate care is physical therapy and rehab. That too is part of long-term care, but it's just not a big piece of the pie. So custodial care represents 95% of the type of care, types of services that somebody needs once they end up in a long-term care situation. So why do I point that out to you? Well, it's important if you've ever looked through your health insurance, okay, which ultimately then becomes Medicare, and you looked and saw where you're covered and where you're exposed, here's what you'll find. For skilled care through traditional health insurance and also really through Medicare, you're covered for up to the first 100 days. And again, that's for surgeries and doctor's visits and procedures. But then after that, we're on our own. We're not covered. Now, for intermediate care, physical therapy and rehab and things of that nature, generally you're covered for somewhere between 45 and 60 days per occurrence per year. But then after that, you're not covered. And then if it comes to custodial care is helping somebody with those activities of daily living or supervising somebody with a cognitive condition, and that's just not covered at all. So really, for the very essence of what long-term care is, which is custodial care, it happens to be the only thing that's not covered by traditional forms of health insurance. Now, Medicare, if you underline the last 4 letters of that word, it spells care. It's medical care from when you turn 65 and beyond. Now, Medicare is not designed to pay for custodial care. And in fact, you get a statement from Social Security. This is actually the back of page, I believe it's 4 or page 6. And in the top left-hand corner, it basically says right here in fine print, Medicare does not pay for long-term care, so you might want to consider options for private insurance. So they tell us this every year. I just know that most people don't read this statement, unfortunately, and so it's kind of our job to help bring this education to you proactively. So health insurance and Medicare really are not part of the options conversation. When you talk about long-term care, it's really important to understand the topic of claims and the costs that are involved with long-term care itself. Now, when you look at a claim or when somebody ends up on a long-term care situation, it's not just a nursing home that we're talking about. In fact, as we talked about earlier, 82% of long-term care takes place either at home or in some sort of assisted living. So when you add it all together and you look at the totality of somebody who needed long-term care from when it started to when they stopped needing care or when they died, it's generally about 5.5 years for women and a little over 4 years for men. Now, if we look at some of the costs, keep in mind that these costs vary in different parts of the nation. So different geographical regions have different costs. New York would naturally be different than down south, for example. Now, for home care, you're talking somewhere between $18 and $25 per hour. So about $90,000 a year to have home care for half a day, every day. Then you have assisted living facilities that might start off a little bit less and then they get a little bit more expensive as time goes on. And then adult daycare is when you drop somebody off and then you pick them back up. That could be a rather inexpensive option, maybe $50 to $100 per day depending on the facility. And then you have nursing homes. Okay, there's places here in New Jersey, for example, which is where I live, that could cost between $250 to $350 per day. But you're talking somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 per year. The big challenge, however, is that we know that the costs have been increasing rather consistently between 4 and 5% every year for the last 30 years. So at that rate, let's take a look at the future of long-term care for you personally. Now, if somebody needed long-term care today and it costs $200 per day and they needed 4 years worth of care, that's going to mean that they have to come up with about $292,000 to pay for long-term care. But let's just say it didn't happen today. Let's say it happened in about 15 years or so. Well, that same care, just because of inflation alone, is going to cost somewhere closer to $400 per day. So that same 4 years of care is going to cost about $550,000 to $600,000, for all 4 years combined. Now, let's say that it wasn't 15 years from now, but it was maybe 25 or 30 years down the road. Well, that same care is going to cost closer to $800 per day. So for 4 years, you're talking a little over $1 million of out-of-pocket money to pay for long-term care claims. That's a lot of money, and I think that's probably what most people what their biggest concern is about this topic. Now, we talked about longevity. Okay, we talked about what long-term care is, perhaps versus what people think it is. On the next couple of videos, we're going to go through what options you have. Then we're going to talk about how you can customize a plan and then give you an idea of some of the sample costs. So, thanks for watching Section 2, and we'll jump into Section 3 next.